The second gift. Trump sat alone in the back seat of his car, staring at the map in his hands. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of wet concrete and distant smoke. His driver kept glancing at him in the mirror, but Trump didn't notice. The map felt heavy, as though it carried more than paper. It carried memories, questions, and something he couldn't yet name. The X was drawn in thick black ink right over a neighborhood in Queens, not far from where he had grown up. His fingers traced the streets on the map, and as he did, he felt a strange pull in his chest. A quiet voice inside him, one he hadn't heard in years, whispered, "You know this place. You know why you're going back." When the car finally stopped, Trump didn't get out right away. He sat there, staring through the window at the row of narrow brick houses and cracked sidewalks. Nothing here had really changed. Kids' laughter echoed faintly from somewhere down the street, and old men stood on the corners talking quietly, just like they had decades ago. The driver turned to him and asked, "Sir, are you sure about this?" Trump didn't answer. He simply opened the door and stepped out, pulling his overcoat tight against the cold breeze. The air here was different, raw and honest, and it made his chest ache. The map had led him to a corner where an old bookstore stood, its windows dusty and dim. The sign above the door hung crookedly, the letters faded almost beyond recognition. He stood in front of it for a long time, staring at the door. He could almost hear his mother's voice in his mind. "Books are where your heart lives." It had been so long since he thought about her, about how she used to bring him here on Sundays to buy him a book and tell him stories under this very roof. His hand hovered over the doorknob, and for the first time in years, he hesitated. He didn't want to see what waited for him inside, not really, but the memory of the boy's sad eyes in the park pushed him forward. When the door creaked open, the smell of dust and paper wrapped around him like a blanket. The air was heavy with silence. Faint light spilled in through the dirty windows, illuminating rows of forgotten shelves lined with books that hadn't been touched in years. As he stepped inside, the door closed quietly behind him, leaving him in a dim hush. His shoes crunched softly on the worn wooden floor. Every step felt louder than the last. Then, from somewhere deep inside the store, he heard it, faint music, soft and haunting, as if someone was playing an old music box. He froze, his breath catching in his chest. At the center of the store stood a small table. It looked out of place, clean, polished, and bathed in a strange light. On it sat a box, much larger than the one he'd been given in the park. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied neatly with twine. A note lay beside it, written in the same careful handwriting as before. It read, "Open this with your heart, not your hands." He picked up the note and read it again, puzzled. What did that mean? He reached for the box anyway, but stopped when he heard a voice behind him. "Do you even remember what your heart feels like?" The words were soft but sharp, cutting through the silence. Trump spun around. Standing there in the shadows was the boy. He looked smaller now, his face pale, his eyes full of something Trump couldn't quite understand. Not anger, not pity, but something deeper. The boy stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Trump. Trump opened his mouth to speak, but found no words. Instead, he looked back at the box. It seemed to hum faintly, almost as if it were alive. The boy spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't open it with your hands because your hands, they've forgotten, but your heart hasn't. Try." Trump closed his eyes, feeling ridiculous. But then he remembered dinners at this very bookstore when his mother would read. To him, the warmth of her hand on his shoulder, the way she'd always tell him he was meant for more than money and buildings. He thought of the kindness he'd once carried in his chest before the world taught him to hide it. His throat tightened. For the first time in years, he felt tears burning behind his eyelids. Slowly, he placed both hands over the box but didn't pull at the twine. Instead, he let himself feel everything. The memories, the regrets, the longing for something he couldn't quite name. As he did, the box began to glow faintly. The strings untied themselves. The paper peeled back as if carried by some invisible wind. And then it opened. Inside lay a single, faded photograph. Trump stared at it for a long time, unable to breathe. It was his mother, young, smiling, radiant, holding a tiny carved bird in her hands. Identical to the one from the first box, her eyes seemed to sparkle even from the photograph. Written on the corner of the picture were the words, "You were always enough." Trump, single quotes as hands trembled as he lifted the photograph. His chest ached. Memories came flooding back of her waiting at the kitchen table late at night, of her voice saying, "You don't have to prove anything to me. I already love you." But he had forgotten. He had buried it deep beneath ambition, pride, and anger. And now, here it was, waiting for him in an old bookstore in Queens. Just as he was about to speak, the boy's voice cut through the quiet again. "There is still a third gift, but you have to let go of something first." Trump turned to him, confusion etched into his face. "Let go of what?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows. Trump followed, but when he reached the spot where the boy had stood, there was nothing, no footsteps, no sound, just the faint music still playing somewhere deep in the store. Trump called out, his voice cracking slightly. But the boy did not return. Outside, the rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the windows, as if marking the end of something and the beginning of something else. Trump stood there in the silence, holding the photograph close to his chest. He felt smaller somehow, like the boy he used to be, and the weight of everything he had done seemed to settle on his shoulders. He looked down at the box, now empty except for a scrap of paper at the bottom. He hadn't noticed it before. He reached in and unfolded it. In the same delicate handwriting, it said, "The third gift waits where your anger lives. Find it before it's too late." He read the words over and over, each time feeling his chest tighten. The third gift, where his anger lived. But where was that? He didn't know. Or maybe he did and just didn't want to face it. He tucked the photograph into his coat pocket and walked out of the bookstore, the bell above the door chiming faintly as he stepped back into the cold, wet air. The streets outside seemed quieter now, as though the world itself was waiting for him to decide. He stood there under the dim streetlight, staring down at the map in his hands. It had changed. Another X now appeared, this one drawn over a tall building in the heart of Manhattan. The lines of the map seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, urging him forward. Trump closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the photograph in his pocket, the carved bird in his other hand, and the memory of the boy's words ringing in his ears. You have to let go of something first. The rain began to fall harder, running down his face like tears he refused to shed. He took one last look at the dark windows of the bookstore before climbing back into the car. The driver glanced at him but said nothing. Trump simply handed him the map and whispered, "Take me there." As the car pulled away, Trump stared out the window, watching the familiar streets blur into a haze of light and shadow. In the distance, the tall buildings of Manhattan loomed like silent witnesses to what was coming. And somewhere inside him, buried deep but stirring now, was the quiet truth he had tried to ignore for so long. But he knew now. He couldn't run from it any longer, because the third gift was waiting. And he could already feel it calling him. The sacrificeth car rolled slowly through the streets of Manhattan as the sky darkened into twilight. Raindrops streaked the windows like tiny rivers of light, blurring the world outside into a swirl of gray and gold. Trump sat in the back seat, silent, his hands folded tightly in his lap. In his pocket, the photograph of his mother pressed against his chest like a quiet heartbeat. The carved bird rested in his palm, its smooth wooden wings cool against his skin. He kept glancing at the map spread out beside him, where the next X glowed faintly over a tall, familiar building in the center of the city. He knew the building well. It was his own. But something about the way the X was drawn, something about the boy's last words, made it feel like he was about to walk into a place he had never really seen before. When the car stopped at the curb, the driver turned to him, his eyes hesitant. "We're here," he said softly, as if afraid to disturb the heavy quiet in the car. Trump didn't answer. He stepped out slowly, pulling his coat tight as the cold wind bit at his face. Above him, the skyscraper loomed like a shadow against the stormy sky, its glass windows catching what little light remained and throwing it back in sharp, broken pieces. He stood there for a moment, staring up at it, his breath fogging the air, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name, fear, maybe, or shame. Inside, the lobby was quiet, almost eerily so. The familiar marble floors and golden fixtures no longer looked grand to him. They looked hollow. Every sound, the echo of his shoes, the faint hum of the lights seemed to stretch on forever. At the far end of the room, Sundar stood waiting. Beside him, the boy leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his dark eyes fixed on Trump. The boy's expression was unreadable, but his gaze pierced through Trump like glass. "You came," Sundar said softly, though it was not really a question. Trump nodded stiffly. "You said the third gift is here," he murmured, his voice low, almost uncertain. Sundar didn't move. His face was calm but serious. "It is," he said, "but first, you have to let go of what's inside you. You cannot carry it where we're going." Trump frowned. His jaw tightened. "Let go of what? I don't even know what you mean." The boy finally straightened and stepped forward, his small hands tucked into his coat pockets. His voice was quiet but steady when he spoke. "Your anger," he said simply, "you can't take it with you, not to the next gift. If you don't let it go, the gift will die in your hands." Trump felt his chest clench at those words. Anger. Of all things, that was the one thing he'd learned to hold on to better than anything else. It had been his shield and his weapon, his constant companion through decades of struggle and success. He had fed it, lived by it, even loved it. And now, standing here in this quiet lobby, these two strangers were telling him to put it down like it was nothing. "Do you even know what you're asking me to do?" He snapped, his voice louder now, echoing off the walls. "That anger, it's what made me who I am. It's what got me here." The boy's gaze didn't waver. "No," he said softly. "It's what made you forget who you are." Trump stood frozen, the words cutting deeper than he expected. His hands balled into fists, his breath sharp in his chest. He opened his mouth to argue but stopped when he saw the boy's face. Not defiant, not mocking, just sad. Without another word, Sundar and the boy turned and walked toward the elevator. Trump hesitated, then followed, his footsteps heavy. Inside the elevator, the ride-up was long and silent. The numbers ticked higher and higher, the air growing colder with each passing floor. At the top, the door slid open to reveal the rooftop that the wind hit him immediately, sharp and bitter. The city stretched out below in a sea of lights and shadows, endless and uncaring. Sundar stood by the edge, his coat flapping in the wind. The boy was already there, crouching on the ledge, staring out over the city. Trump stepped forward, his chest tight, his fingers gripping the photograph in his pocket like a lifeline. Sundar spoke without turning. "This is where you face yourself," he said. "Only then can you open the next gift." Trump swallowed hard. "Face myself," he muttered. "And how exactly do I do that?" The boy stood, turned to him, and simply said, "Fall." Trump blinked, startled. "What?" The boy's eyes softened. "You have to let yourself fall. Let go of everything you're holding. Only then will you see what's waiting for you." Trump stared at the edge of the rooftop, the wind whipping at his hair, the city lights twinkling far below. Every instinct in him screamed to step back, to hold on tighter, to fight, to resist. But then he remembered the bookstore, the photograph, the way his mother's eyes had seemed to forgive him even now. His breath shook as he walked closer to the ledge. The boy watched him silently, his face unreadable. Sundar nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Trump closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "Let go." He stepped off the ledge, but instead of falling into darkness, he found himself floating, suspended above the city, the wind carrying him like a feather. Below him, the streets blurred into streams of gold and silver. Above him, the sky opened up, revealing 1,000 quiet stars. He felt it then, the anger tearing away from him like old paper, peeling off layer by layer, leaving behind something raw and aching, but clean. He saw flashes in his mind, arguments he wished he could take back, harsh words he wished he hadn't spoken, people he'd pushed away. And then, one by one, those images faded, replaced by softer ones, laughter, kindness, warmth. When he opened his eyes, he was back on the rooftop, on his knees, breathing hard. Tears streaked his face. Though he hadn't felt them fall, he looked up to see Sundar and the boy standing over him. The boy held out his hand. In it was the third gift, a small glass sphere, glowing faintly in the darkness. "Take it," Sundar said gently. Trump reached out, his fingers trembling, and wrapped them around the sphere. The moment he touched it, light burst from it, filling his mind with memories, not just his own, but every kind word he'd ever spoken to someone else, every moment of mercy, every smile he'd given without thinking. He gasped, whispering to himself, "I didn't know I had all this in me." But just as he began to smile, the glass sphere cracked in his hand, a thin, jagged line slicing through its perfect surface. The light inside flickered and dimmed. Trump stared at it, confused and afraid. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice tight. The boy's eyes widened in alarm. He turned to Sundar and said urgently, "He's not finished yet. He's still holding something back." Sundar's face grew serious. He stepped closer, looking at Trump with something like pity. Trump looked from Sundar to the boy, his breath catching in his throat. "What do you mean? I let it go. I let all of it go." But the boy shook his head slowly, his voice quiet but firm. "Not all of it. There's still something left. The hardest part." Trump clutched the cracked sphere to his chest, feeling its warmth fading, the light inside growing weaker. "Then tell me," he demanded, his voice breaking. "What is it? What's left? What more do you want from me?" The boy met his gaze and said softly, almost sadly, "The final test is not about you. The next gift is not for you." The wind whipped around them, colder now, sharper, as the city stretched out below like an ocean of shadows and stars. Trump stood there, the cracked sphere glowing faintly in his hands, his chest heavy with questions and fear. He stared at the boy, the words echoing in his mind, "The next gift is not for you." And in that moment, for the first time all night, he felt truly afraid of what was coming next. The final testy night air hung heavy on the rooftop, as though the sky itself were waiting for an answer. Trump stood perfectly still, his breath fogging in the cold, his hands wrapped around the cracked sphere that still glowed faintly. The boy's words kept circling in his mind, sharp and unsettling. "The next gift is not for you." He felt the weight of the words pressing into his chest, sinking into the spaces where his anger had once lived. He thought he had already let everything go, thought he had surrendered whatever the boy and Sundar wanted from him. But now, looking into the boy's eyes, dark, quiet, unflinching, he saw the truth, that there was still something inside him he hadn't faced. Something heavier than anger. Something harder to name. The boy stepped closer, his thin coat flapping in the wind. His gaze softened, though it never lost its strange intensity. "You have to face yourself," he said gently. "Only then will you see the final gift." Trump swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Face myself," he repeated under his breath, as if saying it aloud would make it clearer. "How? What does that mean?" Sundar finally spoke, his voice low and even, almost a whisper against the roar of the wind. You already know. We can't show you where to look. You have to take yourself there. Trump looked down at the cracked sphere in his hands. It felt warm still, but weaker now, as though whatever light remained inside it was fading fast. He thought of the boy's eyes back in the park, full of something between sadness and hope. He thought of his mother's photograph, still tucked into his pocket, her smile somehow both comforting and accusing. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, letting the memories come, and then he saw it. Not the rooftops or the city lights, but another place entirely. A memory. A quiet corner of the city, forgotten by everyone except him. He opened his eyes abruptly. Take me to the church, he said. The boy's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Sundar nodded once, as if he'd known all along. Without another word, they turned and led him back through the building. The car ride was silent. The city blurred past the windows, but Trump barely saw it. He stared straight ahead, his hands still clutching the fragile sphere as though it might slip away at any moment. His reflection in the glass caught his eye more than once, the deep lines in his face, the hollowness under his eyes, and he wondered how long it had been since he truly looked at himself. When the car finally stopped, he didn't wait for the driver. He stepped out into the quiet street. The church loomed before him, small, unassuming, tucked between taller buildings that seemed to have forgotten it was there. Its paint was chipped, the steps worn smooth by time, but it was unmistakable. Froze at the foot of the steps. His feet felt heavy, as if the weight of all the years he'd ignored this place was pressing down on him now. Sundar and the boy stood at the top, waiting silently, their faces calm but watchful. Trump finally climbed the steps, each one feeling harder than the last. When he reached the door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. The boy's voice, quiet and steady, broke the silence. This is where it all began. The door creaked open. Inside, the church smelled of wood and dust, and something faintly sweet, like old flowers left too long on an altar. Shafts of moonlight slanted through the tall windows, painting pale patterns on the floor. The air was thick and still. At the front of the church, where the altar should have been, there was instead a large mirror framed in gold. It stood alone, catching the light, its surface flawless and unsettling. Trump stared at it, his stomach twisting. The boy spoke again, his voice softer now. Look. Trump stepped forward, his shoes echoing faintly in the empty space. He stopped in front of the mirror and stared. At first, he saw only himself, the man he knew, older now, worn down, dressed in his expensive coat. But then, the image began to change. He saw himself as a young man, standing tall, his eyes still full of fire and hope. Then a boy, sitting on these very steps, his mother's hand resting on his shoulder. Then a little child, running down this aisle, laughing, unaware of what the world would ask of him later. And then, he saw something that made his chest ache. He saw himself, as he was now, turning his back on all of them. The young man, the boy, the child. They stood together in the mirror, watching him, their faces full of questions he couldn't answer. His younger self stepped closer in the glass, his voice quiet but clear. What happened to you? Trump raised a hand to the mirror but stopped just short of touching it. His throat tightened. I forgot, he whispered. I forgot who I was. The boy's reflection, smaller now but stronger somehow, nodded. You still have time. And with that, the mirror shimmered. Light spilled from it, flooding the room. Trump fell to his knees, covering his face with his hands as warmth spread through him. When he opened his eyes, the cracked sphere in his hands was whole again, glowing brighter than before. But just as he began to breathe easier, the boy stepped forward and handed him a fourth box, wrapped in black paper, tied with a simple string. What's inside? Will change everything, the boy said, but you have to open it in front of everyone. Trump stared at the box, his pulse quickening. What? He asked, his voice rough. Sundar stepped beside the boy, their eyes locked on him. Tomorrow, Sundar said, at the tower, be ready. The unveiling morning came heavy and gray, the sky churning with low clouds that seemed to press down on the city. Trump woke before dawn, though he didn't remember falling asleep. He sat at the edge of his bed, fully dressed, staring at the fourth box on the nightstand. It lay there silently, wrapped in black paper and tied with string, as though it was waiting for him to prove something to it. He reached for it once in the dark, only to pull his hand back, afraid of what it might demand from him when the time came. He rose slowly, the stiffness in his back and legs reminding him of just how long he had been carrying this weight, this life. When he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror across the room, he barely recognized the man staring back. The lines on his face looked deeper today, his eyes darker, his hands older. But there was something else in his reflection now too, a quiet determination, fragile but unmistakable, glinting faintly beneath the years of anger and pride. Outside, the city was already waking up, the streets filling with cars and hurried footsteps and the metallic hum of morning. His driver opened the car door without a word, his expression unreadable. Trump slid into the back seat, the box resting heavily on his lap. Through the window, the familiar streets passed by in a blur of steel and glass and gray light. He thought of the boy's voice echoing in his mind, "You have to open it in front of everyone." When the car pulled up to the tower, Trump's chest tightened. A crowd had already gathered at the base of the building. Reporters with cameras flashing, people holding their phones high, others whispering among themselves. Their faces a mix of curiosity, doubt, and something he couldn't quite name. He hesitated at the curb. The box in his hands felt heavier now, almost pulsing faintly, as if it knew how much was at stake. Then he stepped out. The noise hit him all at once. The shouted questions from the reporters, the clicking of cameras, the murmurs rippling through the crowd. He ignored them all, keeping his eyes fixed on the entrance. His shoes struck the marble floor inside the lobby like small, decisive hammers. The sound of them followed him as he rode the elevator to the top, his grip tightening on the box. At the rooftop, Sundar and the boy were waiting. They stood at the edge, looking out over the city, their backs to him. The boy turned slightly as Trump approached, his dark eyes catching the light. Unreadable but expectant. The wind whipped around them, colder and sharper than the night before. Trump walked to the center of the rooftop where a simple wooden table had been placed. Microphones lined its edge, their black stems reaching toward him like questions he couldn't yet answer. He set the box on the table. The crowd below quieted when they saw him there, their voices fading into a heavy silence. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. Trump stood behind the table, his hands resting on either side of the box, staring down at it. His reflection shone faintly on the glossy surface of the wood, and for a moment he felt like he was back in the church, looking into that mirror, watching his younger self silently ask him, "What happened to you?" He closed his eyes, inhaled the cold air deeply, and spoke. His voice cracked at first, uncertain, but grew stronger with each word. He spoke of the boy, of the gifts, of the bookstore and the photograph, of his anger and his failures. He spoke of the way he had spent his life building walls around himself, around his heart, and how he had mistaken those walls for strength. He told them about the first gift, the carved bird, and how it reminded him of the innocence he'd lost. He told them about the photograph of his mother, the mirror that had shown him what he'd turned away from, the cracked sphere that revealed the kindness still hiding in the corners of his memory. He confessed the things he'd done in anger, the people he'd hurt, the words he wished he could take back. He said, simply, "I was wrong." His voice broke again, but this time, he didn't try to stop it. "I forgot who I was. I forgot who we all are. But I want to change, starting today." And then he placed his hands on the black box. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the string fell away on its own. The paper unwrapped, curling back slowly, revealing a plain wooden box beneath it. Trump lifted the lid, his hands trembling. Inside was nothing but a single sheet of paper. Folded once, he picked it up and unfolded it carefully. On it were 5 simple words: "Say what's in your heart." He stared at the paper for a long time, his chest tightening, his throat dry. He looked up at the silent crowd below, then at the boy and Sundar, who stood watching him, their faces calm but alert. He dropped the paper back into the box and took a deep breath, and then he spoke again, not rehearsed, not careful, but raw and unguarded. He spoke of love, of regret, of the people he wished he'd loved better. He spoke of his brother, his children, his friends who had drifted away. He spoke of how much he missed feeling like he mattered because of who he was, not because of what he owned. He held up the glowing sphere, now whole again, and said, This is what kindness looks like. It's what I want to give back." The crowd below was silent. A few people wiped at their eyes. Even the reporters seemed unsure of what to do, but just as a faint smile began to creep onto his face, the glass sphere in his hand flickered. The light inside it wavered, dimming suddenly, cracks reappearing along its surface. Trump froze. He looked down at it, fear clawing at his chest. "No," he whispered, "not again." The boy's eyes widened. He turned to Sundar and whispered, urgently, though Trump couldn't make out the words. Sundar's face grew grave, his gaze fixed on the dimming sphere. Trump looked up at them, his voice breaking. "What's happening?" "I did everything you asked." The boy stepped forward, his expression unreadable, and spoke softly. "You're not finished yet. The light is not just yours to carry." Trump's hand shook as he clutched the fading sphere. "Then whose is it? What more do you want from me?" The boy stared at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "The final gift is what you give to someone else." The word struck him like a blow. His breath caught. The wind around them seemed to howl louder, the city lights below blurring into rivers of gold and silver. He stood there in the silence, the sphere flickering faintly in his hand, the box empty before him, the crowd below waiting for him to speak again. But he had no words, only questions. The final gift rooftop was silent except for the wind, which whistled cold and sharp around them, tugging at Trump's coat and hair. He stood there, clutching the fragile sphere in his hands, its light faint now, as though it could go out at any moment. The boy's words still hung heavy in the air, sinking deep into him. "Are you ready to give it away?" He didn't answer, couldn't answer. His mouth felt dry, his chest tight. He stared at the sphere, watching the cracks spread across its surface like spider webs. It still pulsed weakly, a soft glow bleeding through his fingers. His own reflection shimmered in the glass, and he hated what he saw. A man who had taken and held everything close, thinking it was strength. He had spent his life filling his hands, but now they felt clumsy, unworthy to hold this delicate thing. He finally whispered, his voice almost lost to the wind. "Who?" The boy stepped closer, his eyes steady but sad. "You already know," he said softly, "the one you hurt the most."